we've been looking at the 7 churches of Asia, you remember, and we looked at Ephesus, the apostolic, sub-apostolic church, up to about probably 150, 200 AD, and that was Ephesus. Ephesus means pleasant, and it was a pleasant church. It was sound in doctrine. They were working for the Lord, serving the Lord. One thing was lacking, though, Jesus said, their first love. So we need to realize that we need to worship the Lord and serve the Lord out of love to the Lord, or else it doesn't count for eternity. Then we came to the suffering church, Smyrna, which goes from the 2nd century up to about 313 AD. The Edict of Milan was Constantine, and the persecution of the Christian church ended then, largely, and everybody thought that was wonderful, but actually it led to Pergamos. That is a marriage of the church of St. Pergamos, means thoroughly married, and it was very popular and favorable to be a Christian, so many of them were false professing Christians, not real Christians, and the church started to decline in real spirituality. And then we come to Thyatira, we get into the depths of Satan, and where the woman, you remember, the Jezebel, is exalted, and we see Marioltry coming in, and the exaltation of the church above Christ himself. And all through history we see Satan's counterfeit reflected there, the large virgin mother, her little child, from Nimrod's wife, Semiramis, and the little supposedly virgin-born child, Tammuz, and then Isis and Osiris in Egypt, and Aphrodite and Eros in Greek, and Venus and Cupid in Rome, and then finally the large virgin mother and the little child. And then we find the 5th church, Sardis, escaped from that. And the Protestant Reformation, the coming of Martin Luther, they escaped from much of this darkness. And they realized that salvation was by faith alone. We are justified by faith alone, not by faith plus works, as the Catholic Church still teaches. And then we noticed that the Protestant church was largely became dead too. Jesus said, "You have a name to live, but you're dead." And we have another church come in, and that's the one we've been looking at for the last few weeks, the Church of Philadelphia, the Church of Brotherly Love. And here we see an explosion of all over the world, mission societies beginning, and Bible societies beginning, and Sunday schools, and great revivals, and the circuit riders in Western states, the Methodists and the Baptists, and Jonathan Edwards, and Finney, and Charles Finney, and tremendous explosion of the gospel. And we were noticing this way that God had prepared for this. We were talking about the artist studio. You remember the story of the artist studio, and how that painting at Dusseldorf was the means of conversion of Count Zinzendorf, and how he was used of God to revive the Moravian mission. And through the Moravian missions, John Wesley was reached, and the Wesleyan movement, the Methodist Church, was originated. And then we have about a century after that again, we have God moving in and using the Moravians, the Methodists, to reach Charles Haddon Spurgeon. And that was about 1832, I think it was, or 35. And Charles Haddon Spurgeon came to know the Lord as his Savior, and it was through him that, to a large extent, the Baptist movement in the United Kingdom and throughout the world was revived. And then we come a century later in this Philadelphia church to the conversion of Billy Graham through the Baptists. Rather interesting, and the story is quite intriguing. My daughter, I was telling somebody, gave me this, the autobiography of Billy Graham, called "Just As I Am," the autobiography of Billy Graham, for my birthday this summer. And I was reading through it, and I wish I had time to read a great deal of it, but I was sharing a little bit of it, how Billy Graham's mother, she was influenced by many of the people that I was influenced by as a child. My father used to read the same writers to me as Billy Graham mentions here. There were people like Arnold C. Gabeline, Harry Ironside, a number of his writings. We've still got some of Gabeline. And Donald Gray Barnhouse, I remember listening to him every Sunday night. He was a Presbyterian preacher in Philadelphia. I actually heard him speak in person when I was at the University of Toronto. That'd be in the early 1950s. And so Billy Graham's mother was a great influence on him. And his father also. And his father was undoubtedly a believer, but he had problems with the doctrine of eternal security. He wasn't sure whether he could be lost again or not. And that's a problem with many people. Anyway, he was greatly helped when a tremendous gospel preacher came to the area where they lived. It was at Charlotte, South Carolina, I think they lived in. And this man's name was Mordecai Ham. Mordecai Ham.
H-A-M?
H-A-M, yeah, he was a ham.
Okay.
Because my initials spell Ham, Harold Arthur McCarthy.
It's not hard to remember that name when he comes in the door. Oh, sorry.
It's okay, Richard. Anyway, this preacher came to their area, and it was rather interesting. He was known as a fighting evangelist.
Really?
And Billy Graham mentions here that he received a lot of attention when he claimed that there was a house across from the high school that Billy Graham attended where more things were going on than just having them in for tea. And this raised a big kerfuffle in the area, and Billy Graham decided he would never go to hear him. But there was a friend of his, a lovely Christian named Albert Mackin, and he said, "Why don't you come and hear our fighting preacher?" He suggested. "Is he a fighter?" I asked. That put a little.
I is Billy Graham, is it?
No, this is Mordecai Ham.
Oh, Mordecai Ham.
And Albert McMack, his Christian friend, said to him, "Why don't you come and hear the fighting preacher?" And Billy Graham said, "Is he a fighter?" And that put a little different slant on things. "I like a fighter." As Billy had said, I'm never going to go to hear him because he's told all these stories about how awful this house is across from the high school I attend. I guess they were having sex things there. Anyway, Albert added the incentive of letting me drive his old vegetable truck. And Billy Graham was very excited about driving, having a chance to drive. They took truck into town for the meeting, loaded with as many folks, white and black, as he could get to go along. We all sat in the rear of the auditorium to see the show, with a few thousand other people, one of the largest crowds I'd ever been in. As soon as the evangelist started his sermon, he opened his Bible and talked straight from his text. He talked loudly, even though there was an amplifying system. I have no recollection of what he preached about, but I was spellbound. In some indefinable way, he was getting through to me. I was hearing another voice, as was often said of Dwight L. Moody when he preached, the voice of the Holy Spirit. Bumping along in the truck on the way home, I was deep in thought. Later, after I stretched out on my back in bed, I stared out the window at a Carolina moon for a long time. The next night, all my father's mules and horses could not have kept me from getting to that meeting. From then on, I was a faithful attendant, night after night, week after week. The tabernacle was well filled all the time. One reason for the good attendance was Dr. Ham's choice of lively topics, like the second coming of Christ. Mother had read about the second coming in the book of Revelation, of course, but I did not recall having heard of it. He also preached on subjects such as money, infidelity, the Sabbath, and drinking. I had never heard a sermon on hell either, though I was familiar with some people's use of the term as a swear word. Certainly our clergyman, Dr. Lindsay, never mentioned that it was a real place, even though I knew he believed there was a hell, but Dr. Ham left no doubt about it in anybody's mind. That was not to say that Dr. Ham neglected or minimized the great love of God. He just put it against the background of sin and judgment and hell in a novel way that fascinated me. His words and his way with words grabbed my mind and gripped my heart. What startled me was the same preacher who warns us so dramatically about the horrible fate of the lost in the everlasting lake of fire and brimstone also had a tremendous sense of humor and could tell stories almost as good as my father. I became deeply convicted about my sinfulness and rebellion and confused. How could this evangelist be talking to me of all people? I'd been baptized as a baby and had learned the shorter catechism, word perfect, and had been confirmed in the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church with the full approval of the pastor and elders. So basically, Billy Graham's family now were Presbyterians. His mother had background in the Free Church of Scotland, which is a little different but similar. Anyway, so I got into mischief once in a while, but I could hardly be called wicked. I resisted temptations to break the moral code my parents had so strictly instilled in me. I was a good milker in the dairy barn and never complained about any of the nasty work such as shoveling manure. I was even the vice president of my youth group at our church, although granted it wasn't a particularly vital organization. So why would the evangelist be pointing his bony finger at me? One thing that echoed in my mind was Dr. Ham singing right in the middle of his sermon, "The toils of the road will seem nothing when I get to the end of the way." He had an almost embarrassing way of describing sins and shortcomings in a demanding, untainted divine judgment that we bend our ways. I was so sure he had singled me out one night that I actually ducked behind the wide-brimmed hat of the lady sitting in front of me. Yet, as uncomfortable as I was getting to be, I simply could not stay away. At the meetings, I struck up an acquaintance with a likable student from the notorious Central High School, Grady Wilson. You remember Grady Wilson? Worked with Billy Graham and with George Beverly Shea and with Cliff Barrows for decades.
Yes.
Anyway, he was already a Christian.
They were a team.
Pardon?
I said that was a very close-knit team.
Yes, indeed. A wonderful team. He was already a Christian, but he was having some problems of his own under Dr. Ham's preaching. He had an older unconverted brother, Thomas Walter, called TW by everybody, a big fellow who could be pretty rough. I would not call him a bully, at least not to his face, but I could safely describe him as burly. TW would certainly have had a job as a bouncer. Grady and I had both decided on a strategy to avoid the frontal attack by Dr. Ham. We had signed up for the choir, which sat on the platform behind the preacher. He was getting uncomfortable sitting in front of the preacher, so I thought, I'll join the choir and then I'll be behind the preacher and the preacher won't be pointing at me all the time. So we had signed up for the choir, which sat on the platform behind the preacher. Neither of us could sing, but we could move our mouths or hold a hymn book in front of our faces for camouflage. As choir members, we were safe from Dr. Ham's accusatory stare. Another person who was very important to me at the time of the Ham meeting was my first cousin, Kirk Stafford. He lived in town and had a job as an accountant. Some years my senior, he always went out of his way to be kind and thoughtful to me as we were growing up. He not only encouraged me to go to the tabernacle in the evenings, but he would drive out and get me if I had no one to take me. He also was in the choir. What was slowly dawning on me during those weeks was the visible realization that I did not know Jesus Christ for myself. This is amazing. With all the religion that he had, he came to realize, as Mordecai Ham preached the gospel, that he did not know Jesus Christ for himself. I could not depend on my parents' faith. Christian influence in the home could have a lasting impact on a child's life, but faith could not be passed on as an inheritance like the family's silver. It had to be exercised by each individual. So Billy Graham used to often say that, you remember, you can't become a Christian because you live in a church any more than you become a car because you live in a garage.
Yeah, Joyce Meyer uses that.
Consciously.
Yes.
I think the church has got to be more within your heart than you living in it.
Yeah.
It's got to live within you.
So Billy says, I could not depend on my church membership either, saying I believe in the Apostles' Creed every Sunday or taking the bread and wine of communion could so easily become nothing but rote and ritual without power in themselves to make me any different. Nor could I depend on my own resolution to do better. I constantly failed in my efforts at self-improvement. Nobody needed to tell me about that. As a teenager, what I needed to know for certain was that I was right with God. I could not help but admit to myself that I was purposeless and empty-hearted. Our family Bible reading, praying, psalm singing, and church going always had left me restless and resentful. I'd even tried guiltily to think upon ways of getting out of all those activities as much as I could. In a word, I was spiritually dead. And then it happened, sometime around my 16th birthday. On that night, Dr. Ham finished preaching and gave the invitation to accept Christ. After all his tirades against sin, he gave us a gentle reminder that God commendeth his love toward us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Romans 5 and 8. The song leader, Mr. Ramsey, led us all in Just As I Am. 4 verses. That's Billy Graham's theme song, Just As I Am, without one plate. And then we started another song, almost persuaded now to believe. I remember singing that often as a boy myself. Almost will not avail, almost is but to fail. Sad, sad, the bitter wail, almost but lost. And on the last verse of that second song, I responded. I walked down to the front, feeling as if I had lead weights attached to my feet, and stood in the space before the platform. That same night, perhaps 300 or 400 other people were there at the front making spiritual commitments. The next night, my cousin Kirk Stafford made his decision for Christ. My heart sank when I looked over at the lady standing next to me with tears running down her cheeks. I was not crying. I did not feel any special emotion of any kind just then. Maybe I thought I was not supposed to be there. Maybe my good intentions to be a real Christian wouldn't last. Wondering if I was just making a fool of myself, I almost turned around and went back to my seat. As I stood in front of the platform, a tailor named J.D. Prevat, who was a friend of our family with a deep love for souls, stepped up beside me. Weeping. Putting his arms around me, he urged me to make my decision. At the same time, in his heavy European accent, he explained God's plan for my salvation in a simple way. That explanation was addressed to my own mental understanding. It did not necessarily answer my questions I had at the moment, and it certainly did not, anticipate every question that would come to me in the months and years ahead. But it set forth simply the facts that I needed to know in order to become God's child. This is interesting. My tailor friend helped me to understand what I had to do to become a genuine Christian. The key word was do. Those of us standing up front had to decide to do something about what we do before it would take effect. He prayed for me and guided me to pray. I had heard the message and I felt the inner compulsion to go forward. Now came the moment to commit myself to Christ. Intellectually, I accepted Christ to the extent that I acknowledged what I knew about him to be true. That was mental assent. Emotionally, I felt I wanted to love him in return for his loving me. But the final issue was whether I turned myself over to his rule in my life. I checked recommitment on the card I filled out. After all, I had been brought up to regard my baptism and confirmation as professions of faith too. The difference was that this time I was doing it on purpose, doing it with intention. For all my religious upbringing and church activity, I believe that was a moment I made my real commitment to Jesus Christ. No bells went off inside me, no signs flashed across the tabernacle ceiling, no physical palpitations made me tremble. I wondered again if I was a hypocrite, not to be weeping or something. I simply felt at peace, quiet, not delirious, happy and peaceful. My father came to the front and put his arms around my shoulders, telling me how thankful he was. Later back home, when we went to the kitchen, my mother put her arms around me and said, "Billy Frank, I'm so glad you took the stand you did tonight." That was all. I went upstairs to my room. Standing at the window, I looked out across the fields that were glowing in the moonlight. When I went over to my bed, and for the first time in my life, got down on my knees without being told to do so. I wanted to talk to God. "Lord, I don't know what happened to me tonight," I prayed. "You know, and I thank you for the privilege I've had tonight.
It took a while to fall asleep. How could I face school tomorrow? Would this action spoil my relationship with friends who were not interested in spiritual matters? My coach, Rudy, who had publicly professed his dislike of Dr. Had, made fun of me. Perhaps I felt pretty sure, though, that the school principal, Connor Hutchinson, whose history lessons I enjoyed, would be sympathetic. But the hardest question of all remained to be answered. What exactly had happened to me? And he goes on to explain how the Bible became a new book for him. And this was really the same experience I had that night that I got saved. I wondered too, well, at first I thought,
Can you stick with it?
will it last? Will I be able to be as good as my dad, my mom, and the other Christians? Or what's going on? Just like Billy Graham. And then I realized, as Billy explains, that I could rest entirely on the Word of God. And he tells how that then the Bible became different, and being with Christians instead of being something that I was uncomfortable with started to be something that I enjoyed, and my whole life was changed. And Billy goes on to explain that. And then he goes on, of course, to tell how that he wanted to go to Bible school, and he went to Bob Jones' Bible school at first. I think it was up in Tennessee. And after one semester, his parents persuaded him to try to go to the Florida Bible Institute, and that was a wonderful experience for him. He came into contact with all kinds of wonderful preachers, and they encouraged him to go out and preach on the street corners and to preach in different churches and to preach in all kinds of places and little churches and little groups of people. And he would go to prisons and to hospitals and preach the gospel. And finally, of course, the story of how he became a pastor, and he was ordained in the Baptist church. He was persuaded to change from Presbyterian to Baptist, and he was...
Do you know why?
Well, he had an opportunity to preach at quite an outstanding Baptist church, and his advisor said to him, you'll have a tough time if they know that you are a Presbyterian and you haven't been baptized as a believer. So he was baptized as a believer. And then they said, you'd be a lot better off if you were ordained as a preacher. So a group of these Baptist preachers came together and they ordained him. And then if you're ordained as a preacher officially, you get all kinds of advantages. And that's still true in Canada as well as the States. You get tax advantages, and you get the authority to marry people and to bury people and to do all kinds of things that you can't do if you're not ordained. And then, of course, you remember the story of how he linked up with George Beverly Shea, the great singer, who just died a few months ago at 104 years of age, 10 years older than Billy. Billy, I guess he's still 94 or 95. And then there's a tremendous story of how he had a campaign in Los Angeles. And you remember Hearst, the great newspaper man. He heard about Billy Graham. He liked some of the things that he heard about him. And the word was, he said, push Graham, push Graham. Meaning? So, push Graham, that means promote Graham. Yeah, give him coverage. And the headlines came out in Hearst papers all over the United States about this evangelist Billy Graham. And the Billy Graham campaign just took off.
He came out at the right time, right after the war.
Yes.
And people really needed something to stand firm on.
Very good point.
And he was filled, and he filled his first auditorium and stadium outside the stadium. And it's a picture of it in black and white. This whole football stadium, and it's filled right to the top of the seats.
Yeah.
How old was he then?
He might have been in his probably late 40s, or I'd say.
He was 16 when he saved. That was...
in his 40s, I think, when he really started preaching. Like that.
That was 1935, so...
Well, 45 would be, he'd be 70 years ago. If he's 95 now,
Yeah.
Because it was rated.
24.
he would have been about 24,
24,
25.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, mid-20s, I thought it must
And around 1945.
Yes.
Then he preached in New York City, Madison Square Gardens, and then he was invited to England, you remember? And a tremendous campaign in England, in London, England, and other places. And yeah, remember the great theologians, they said, oh, Billy Graham's preaching this primitive gospel, and that he's setting Christianity back by 100 years. Billy Graham said, well, what I want to do is set it back by 2,000 years, get right back to the
Yeah, what
time
about
of the
that?
apostles. And the Lord Jesus.
You know, his gift was abundant and overflowing.
Yeah.
When he started, because he'd come out like he had been a veteran.
Yeah,
When he started preaching, it was like he'd been doing it already all his life. It
tremendous.
didn't sound like a new egg at the whole thing.
He tells, the connection to that, he tells a lot about how he would, when he was at Bible college, he would go and he would preach in the woods
Yeah.
and across the river, and he would preach to the animals and to the trees.
Well, in the lake sometimes you hear your echo too, eh? Like in the early mornings you might hear yourself because of the clearness, right?
Yeah.
I used to go play my trumpet by a lake when I used to play up, even after I left town. I'd find this place in Bridgewater I'd go sit by.
Yeah.
And it was like a place like.
And
they-
Billy would
they
also
get it.
go and he would preach in the churches where, before the evening service, like in the daytime, the afternoons, and the mornings, and he would practice and rehearse his messages. The first time he was asked to speak, he relates how that he had 4 sermons prepared. He felt that they were about 8 minutes each. And when he actually delivered that message, he used all the 4 sermons at once in about 2 minutes each. So the whole 4 sermons amounted to 8 minutes.
You know what's bad is when you're out in the woods and practicing all this time, then you get to go and you're actually ready to go do the big preaching,
Yeah.
and then you stand up there and you go,
What am I going to say?
yeah, well, you're stuck for a minute, you know what I mean? Because you're used to being comfortable on your own and hearing
That's right.
hearing it, how wonderful this to yourself.
So it's interesting. So I think we'll conclude Lord will with the Philadelphia church there, the Church of Brotherly Love, and this revival is placed within the Protestant movement, and how the Lord spread the gospel all over the world, and the great missions to India, William Carey, and then the Moravian missions, and the missions to China with the Hudson Taylor and the founding of the China Inland Mission, and so then we come to the next week, the Lord willing, we'll look at the the Laodicean church. And the Laodicean church is a church that is basically dead and cold, it's lukewarm. The Lord says, I wish you're either cold or hot, but with this way that you're lukewarm, I want to vomit you out of my mouth. And the Lord Jesus is seen standing outside the door knocking, asking anyone who will to hear his voice and to let him come in, and he will feast with them and they will feast with him. So, Lord willing, we'll have a little look at the Laodicean church next week. And that'll conclude the message.
Chapter 2, is it?
That's chapter 3.
Going into
3.
chapter 3.
We were already in chapter 3.
When do we get into
It starts with Sardis.
when do we get into the next chapter on the life and times of Harold McCarthy?
Yeah, there's a thought.
It's chapter 23, isn't it?
Chapter 23.
Of Revelation.
That's the one after the Bible stops.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right.
My life continues.
We'll get Richie to talk
Actually,
about
in the simplified version, there's a comment by Harold McCarthy.
Oh,
The
really?
last thing that's written in that Bible is a comment by Harold
that.
McCarthy.
Oh boy, oh boy.
Yeah, I don't know if you know.
That's pretty dangerous.
In the simplified version that he's doing.
Ray and I are working on it. We've been looking at the 7 churches of Asia, you remember, and we looked at Ephesus, the apostolic, sub-apostolic church, up to about probably 150, 200 AD, and that was Ephesus. Ephesus means pleasant.
and it was a pleasant church. It was sound in doctrine. They were working for the Lord, serving the Lord. One thing was lacking, though, Jesus said, their first love. So we need to realize that we need to worship the Lord and serve the Lord out of love to the Lord, or else it doesn't count for eternity. Then we came to the suffering church, Smyrna, which goes from in Rome, and then finally the large Virgin Mother and the little child. And then we find the fifth church, Sardis, escaped from that. The Protestant Reformation, the coming of Martin Luther, they escaped from much of this darkness. They realized that salvation was by faith alone. We are justified by faith alone, not by faith plus works, as the Catholic Church still teaches. And then we noticed that the Protestant Church was largely became dead too. Jesus said, "You have a name to live, but you're dead." And we have another second century up to about 313 AD. The Edict of Milan was Constantine, and the persecution of the Christian Church ended then largely. And everybody thought that was wonderful, but actually it led to Pergamus. That is a marriage of the Church of St. Pergamus means thoroughly married, and it was very popular and favorable to be a Christian. So many of them were false professing Christians, not real Christians, and the church started to decline in real spirituality. The church come in, and that's the one we've been looking at for the last few weeks, the Church of Philadelphia, the Church of Brotherly Love. And here we see an explosion of all over the world, mission societies beginning, and Bible societies beginning, and Sunday schools, and great revivals, and the circuit riders in Western states, the Methodists and the Baptists, and Jonathan Edwards, and Finney, and Charles Finney, and tremendous explosion of the gospel. And we were noticing this way that God had prepared for this. We were talking to Eve, and then we come to Thyatira. We get into the depths of Satan, and where the woman, you remember, the Jezebel, is exalted, and we see Mary Olive coming in, and the exaltation of the church above Christ himself. And all through history, we see Satan's counterfeit reflected there, the large Virgin Mother, the little child from Nimrod's wife, Semiramis, and the little supposedly virgin-born child, Tammuz, and then Isis and Osiris in Egypt, and Aphrodite and Eros in Greek, and Venus and Cupid